Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 287, Jonathon Harris, Part 1. A listener got in touch with me to share her story on one of her convict ancestors, Jonathon Harris. He married 3 times and had a total of 17 children. His children, in turn, also had large families, so I'm sure there are many thousands of descendants today. Jonathon Harris's birth is unclear. It's most likely to be in 1800. Various records for Jonathon give his year of birth varying from 1799, which was in the November 1828 census, giving his age as 29, up to 1802, which was what he listed in his labour exemption records of 1831. His native place is variously given as Uckfield, which was in the 1826 convict indents and his 1841 conditional pardon, Wickfield in his 1831 labour exemption record, and Nutfield, which was listed on his 1842 jail record. It's most likely all referring to Uckfield, but probably altered with the pronunciation or the literacy levels of the record keeper of the day. The most likely record is a baptism for a Jonathon Harris on the 12th of October 1800 in Uckfield, Sussex, England. However, there is another baptism record for a John Harris when he was 18 years old in Eldington, Kent, England, on the 26th of March 1816. In this record, John Harris's parents were John Harris and Philadelphia Harris, which does match his parents' names. Why he was baptised again is an unknown. His mother was born Philadelphia Newnham. She was known as Hilda and was born in 1768. Jonathon's father, Jonathon Sr., was 5 years younger than Hilda. Hilda had married Thomas Elkhorn in 1787 and had 3 sons with him, Thomas, George and John. Thomas Elkhorn died in October 1797, aged only 41, when their youngest son was only 6 months old. Some public family trees have Jonathon born on the 12th of July 1798 in Uckfield, making him quite possibly Thomas Elkhorn's biological child. Interestingly, though, in his October 1800 baptism record, it does state that he's the child of John and Philadelphia Harris. Some public family trees indicated that Jonathon Sr. and Hilda were married at the time of Jonathon's baptism. She used the surname Harris, but a marriage record is not to be found. Hilda then married Alexander Vinnall on the 20th of April 1802 when she was 33, and they had a further 7 children together. Sir Jonathon Jr. married Elizabeth Jarvis Baker on the 17th of November 1821 in Mayfield, Sussex, England. Elizabeth was also born in Uckfield. They had 3 children together. Jonathon, who was baptised in March 1822 in Mayfield, Elizabeth in 1824 and Henry William in 1826. Meanwhile, Hilda's 3rd husband, Alexander Vinnall, died in 1825 at Uckfield. This is when Hilda and 2 of her sons, our Jonathon Harris and Martin Vinnall, fell on the wrong side of the law. On the 28th of February 1825 in the Sussex Advertiser, it states, "On Monday, a woman named Philadelphia Vinnall and 2 men of the names of Martin Elchin, which is Elkhorn, and Jonathon Harris, alias Elkhorn." So again, we see that Jonathon is actually using the name of Philadelphia's first husband, were apprehended at Brighton on suspicion of being concerned in the burglary of Mr. Cobham's house at Uckfield and committed to a house of correction for further examination. On the 3rd of March 1825, housebreakers: Jonathon Elchin, alias Harris, alias Vinnall, Martin Elchin, alias Vinnall, and Philadelphia Vinnall, their mother, were re-examined this day on the charge of burglars 3 entering the house of Thomas Cobham, Esquire, at Uckfield on Friday night, and Harris made a full confession by which it appeared that he'd lately broken open 9 or 10 different houses, assisted by 2 others named King and Homewood, and that on the Friday night he, with King and Homewood, broke open the house of Mr. Cobham with a ploughshare and took from thence the property produced.
An amazing quantity of stolen goods consisted of feather beds, wearing apparel and gown pieces found in the woman prisoners and in King's father's house. The lock of Mr. Cobham's desk, which we stated last week was found on the racecourse, was in the woman's possession. These people lived at Crowborough and are of a notorious bad character. King, Homewood and Harris have been in jail for fowl stealing. King and Homewood have hitherto escaped all pursuit, although our Henbras have been indefatigable in their search for them, having travelled in one day upwards of 60 miles through the worst parts of this country. Harris is committed for trial and his mother and brother will be examined again today. On the 31st of March 1825, Philadelphia Vinnell, charged with unlawfully receiving into her possession at Brighton 1 lock, 6 linchpin keys, 50 yards of printed cotton, 1 shirt and other goods, well knowing the same to have been stolen. Fined 1 shilling and to be imprisoned for 1 year in the Lewes House of Correction. On the 28th of March 1825, Jonathon Harris, alias Elkhorn, 23, for burglary breaking into the house of Thomas A. Cobham of Uckfield and stealing a mahogany desk and other articles. Found guilty and a sentence of death recorded. A little further information about the trial. Jonathon Harris, alias Elkhorn, gardener and ploughman, committed on the 28th of February 1825 by Richard Ironmonger, Esquire. Charged with burglary, breaking and entering into the dwelling house of Thomas Cobham at Uckfield and feloniously stealing 6 linen shifts, 1 mahogany desk and other articles valued at 40 shillings. Charged with burglary at Withersfield on the 24th of January 1825 from John Knight and Ebenezer Knight, goods valued at £18 and 13 shillings. The goods were not returned, and he was sentenced to be hanged by the jury on the first charge, and for the second charge the jury said he wasn't guilty and he was acquitted and then reprieved for transportation for life in a colony beyond the sea. And at the same time it mentions that Philadelphia Vinnell was charged with stealing at Buxted on the 28th of February 1825, goods of persons unknown. There was no record of sentence for Philadelphia at this time. She was possibly let off for giving King's evidence in her son Jonathon's case. It seems that after the court case with his half-brother Martin, that Martin seemed to lead a straight life in England after this event. So by the 26th of April, Jonathon was sent to the prison hulk York at Portsmouth. On the 15th of August 1825, he was transported to the convict ship Marquis of Hastings, which then departed Portsmouth on the 22nd of August 1825 as part of the Third Fleet. The Surgeon's Journal of the trip reported that scurvy occurred early in the trip, so they pulled the ship into Rio de Janeiro for supplies and then departed there on the 2nd of November 1825. The ship arrived in Sydney on the 3rd of January 1826. Jonathon was assigned to Charles Thompson. The November 1828 census lists Jonathon, described as 29, not in fact 27, as being assigned as a labourer to an ex-convict, Charles Thompson, and living with Charles, his family, and a large number of other convicts at Clydesdale, in the area of Sydney now called Riverstone. In 1828, he petitioned to have his wife Elizabeth and 3 children join him. The petition lists his family: Elizabeth née Baker, living at Hadler Down, Mayfield; Jonathon, 7 years old; Elizabeth, 5 years old; and John, 2 years old. Note that this last child was born after Jonathon was incarcerated, so Jonathon may not have known this child's actual name. This child, in fact, was named Henry. The petition includes lists of people to whom the family was known. On the 11th of March 1831, Elizabeth and the children, Jonathon, now aged 9, Elizabeth, 7, and Henry, 6, arrived in New South Wales aboard the boat the Canes, which was a female convict transport. They arrived as free settlers and rejoined Jonathon. The family appears to have initially lived in Clydesdale, and Jonathon received an exemption from government labour on the 1st of June 1831, which he would have been assigned to his wife, being free. It lists them as living at Windsor. They appear to move soon afterwards due to another labour exemption that's dated on the 2nd of January 1832, and it's described as replacing the previous one, and it now lists their location as Parramatta. However, this is crossed out with a note saying to be received for Argyll per letter from Parramatta on the 19th of January 1833. So as early as 1833, they moved to the Goulburn-Mittagong area of New South Wales. During the period from 1831, when Elizabeth arrived in New South Wales, and 1836, Elizabeth and Jonathon had 3 more children. Sophia, born on the 15th of January 1832, Thomas, born on the 13th of July 1833, and George, born on the 19th of August 1835. All 3 children were baptised at Parramatta. On the 30th of March 1836, Elizabeth was travelling from Bong Bong to Campbelltown in a cart. She was killed when the cart overturned somewhere around Bringelly. The cart was driven by a young lad, her son, so this was possibly John Jr., who would now be aged 14. It also stated she had an infant in her arms, so probably George, who would be around 7 months at that time. The death was recorded at Cobbitty, and she lies in an unmarked grave about 1 to 2 miles south of the present-day Picton, maybe at Terrelga. In the Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser on the 2nd of April 1836, it outlined the accident. On Wednesday, as a cart containing a woman and infant child was driven by a lad, the son of the woman, that was proceeding from Bong Bong to Campbelltown on the way to the market, the lad allowed the horses to swerve from the road, and coming on a ridge, it capsized, when, awful to relate, the woman fell under the cart and was crushed to death. The feelings of the lad, who was unable to raise the cart from his dying parent, can be better imagined than portrayed. Some time after, the male passing rendered all assistance possible, but the hand of death had marked the unfortunate woman for his victim. All aid was vain. The child, strange to say, escaped uninjured. A coroner's inquest was convened at the time our informant left Campbelltown. So with his wife's death, it's unclear what legal status Jonathon would have had as a convict, and it appears that he may have regressed somewhat. The year following her death, on the 7th of July 1837, Jonathon was jailed in Sydney, charged with robbery. The case was heard in August, and Jonathon was found not guilty. Jonathon Harris was indicted for stealing 3 bullocks, the property of Edmund Lockyer of Lockyer, on the 1st of May. There's some reference to the acquittal being because a key witness, who was John Stroud, an employee of Lockyer, did not appear. He was later found drowned in a creek near Julgeong. There's also unsubstantiated evidence of Jonathon running a sly grog shop at this time. On the 19th of February 1838, Jonathon obtained a ticket of leave, which allowed him to remain in the district of Yass. This was later amended in 1841 to allow him to continue remaining in the Goulburn district. On the 22nd of July 1839, Jonathon's 15-year-old daughter Elizabeth married 29-year-old William Clark in Bowning. This marriage was registered in Gundaroo. The couple moved to Victoria, and William Clark established the Ovens Crossing Run, which eventually became Wangaratta. Jonathon, now aged 39, applied for permission to marry Anne Grubb, a 21-year-old from a respectable Methodist family. This permission was granted on the 29th of September, and they married at the parish of St Saviour in Goulburn 3 weeks later, on the 12th of October 1840. The marriage certificate shows that Jonathon is living at Tumut River. Anne had been born in Dorset, England, and had arrived in Sydney on the 14th of August 1840 with her brother Thomas Grubb and his wife Sarah on the Lady Clark as assisted immigrants. Jonathon and Anne Grubb had 2 children together, William Thomas, born in September 1841, and George Robert Grubb Harris, born in April 1843. On the 1st of October 1841, Jonathon received a conditional pardon at the age of 40. He'd been a convict for 16 years. He leased farming land from William Shelley, and adjacent to the property was Major Edmund Lockyer, a JP politician, police magistrate and superintendent of Parramatta Police, and also a wealthy landowner. He was formerly of the 57th Regiment, nicknamed the Steelbacks, and his property was at Grampian Hills near Goulburn. So less than a year after he received his conditional pardon, on the 22nd of August 1842, Jonathon was again committed to trial for robbery, this time alongside his 20-year-old son, Jonathon Jr. So interestingly, that Edmund Lockyer is again the reason behind why he's been committed for an offence. A newspaper article at the time stated, Yesterday, 4 men were committed to take their trial for robbing Alfred King, an old man, at Chillick's public house on the Sydney Road of £47. The prisoners and prosecutor had come down from the country from near Goulburn in company. 2 of the prisoners have been sent to the Hyde Park barracks to be identified. The other 2 are Jonathon Harris and his son Jonathon, who are committed. The father holds a ticket of leave. 6 £1 notes, part of the property, were found concealed in one of the drays. A document obtained from the Archives Office from letters to the Colonial Secretary. There's a letter written by Major Edmund Lockyer on the 3rd of January 1843, which makes serious accusations against Jonathon and demands that Jonathon be taken into custody. The points he made were that Jonathon was employed by William Shelley and resided on a small block which was part of Grampian Hills owned by Shelley. The block was adjacent to Lockyer's property, Lockyer Lee. A large amount of wheat belonging to Lockyer was stolen. Jonathon was known to be selling wheat to various persons, but he had none growing himself at that time. He was suspected by Lockyer as having been the culprit. At about the same time, an iron axle and wheels were stolen from a dray left in a paddock a mile from Jonathon's hut. When questioned, Jonathon continually looked at a place called Sandy Creek. Lockyer returned with some of his men and searched the creek, and they found the axle and dray. No action was taken as there was not sufficient evidence to charge Jonathon. Jonathon was also employed by Shelley to transport goods from him to his other property at Tumut River, hence the reference to the place of abode on his marriage certificate with Anne Grubb. An employee of Lockyer's, John Stroud, when driving cattle to Mingay, 40 miles from Gundagai, met Jonathon driving a team of bullocks. 3 of the bullocks belonged to Lockyer. Jonathon was charged with stealing the cattle in the Supreme Court in Sydney. However, there is no record of this trial. As mentioned, he was acquitted due to John Stroud's drowning. Interestingly, he was found in a creek that only had water knee-deep near Julgiong. And Lockyer also stated that Jonathon returned to his residence and he ran a sly grog shop. So some descendants wonder whether Jonathon was guilty of these crimes, as anyone that was connected with them after their arrival in Australia had good reports of Jonathon Sr. and his son. Jonathon Sr. had established stock and he'd worked for Mr. and Mrs. Shelley for many years. Elizabeth had rented land from Mrs. Shelley before her death in the Bringilly area. The only person who stood anything to gain from ridding himself of the Harris family was Edmund Lockyer, who obviously did not like the family rising above themselves. So I'll leave that up to you, whether you believe that Lockyer was driving them out and created a situation where they could be convicted, or was this in fact Jonathon and his son, particularly Jonathon, involving himself in illegal activities. Jonathon and Jonathon Jr. were initially held in the Darlinghurst jail and then were subsequently convicted on the 10th of September 1842. The other 2 people mentioned were acquitted. They were then transferred to Cockatoo Island on the 14th of September 1842. Records state that Jonathon Harris Sr. received a life sentence at this time, with Jonathon Harris Jr. receiving 15 years. However, Jonathon Sr. was given a conditional pardon by Governor George Gipps in September 1843, and he was transferred to Van Diemen's Land on the Sir John Byng, leaving Sydney on the 14th of October 1843 and arriving on the 28th of October. Because of his conviction, all of Jonathon's property in New South Wales was forfeited to the government, including 21 bullocks, 1 mare, 3 drays, various items and 20 acres of wheat. Anne petitioned to the governor for any surplus funds after the goods were sold. The petition mentioned she had 5 children to support, likely to be Jonathon's children with Elizabeth Baker and her own child, and quite possibly George, who she was pregnant with at this time. The governor was unwilling to allow her to keep some of the family's possessions or even the surplus from the sale at the Goulburn police station. Anne had their son George 6 months after Jonathon was convicted. Anne remained in Goulburn, New South Wales. She lived with her brother and sister-in-law, Thomas and Sarah Grubb, at Murray's Flat, and then she married William Oliver in 1861. She listed herself as a widower on the marriage certificate. Birth certificates of the Oliver children note that William and Anne lived together from 1843 in Goulburn. Anne possibly was not prepared to marry until some time had passed since the transportation of her husband, and no further contact was made, which was known as the 7-year rule. So if you did not know the whereabouts of your spouse or they were transported as a convict after 7 years, you were then free to remarry. William Oliver was a confectioner and a baker, and Thomas and Sarah Grubb were the witnesses at their wedding. Only 10 months after their marriage, on the 30th of December 1861, Anne died of heart disease on the goldfields near Burrangong. She was only 42. Her death certificate shows that she died on goldfields just outside Young. She's buried in Young Cemetery. In 1848, Jonathon was granted a conditional pardon, and in 1849, however, this was revoked. After 6 years in Van Diemen's Land, Jonathon finally was granted a ticket of leave. In October 1850, he's listed as being employed by George Elkhorn, listed as Helcorn, who was in fact his older brother, who was born in 1794. On the 17th of May 1851, Jonathon received a conditional pardon for the second time, after serving 9 years of a 15-year sentence. On the 18th of May 1853, Jonathon received approval to marry for a third time to Mary Ann Squires. On the 20th of June 1853, Jonathon, who's now 53 but listed himself as 50, and Mary, aged 25, so less than half his age and actually younger than his two eldest children, they married in Hobart. Mary Ann was a convict. She'd arrived on the ship Anna Maria 2 years earlier, on the 4th of October 1851. The witnesses at the wedding were his half-brother George and Frances Elkhorn, but was listed as Helchorn on the marriage certificate. At the Devonshire Midsummer Sessions at the Castle of Exeter, held on the 2nd of July 1850 at the Assizes, Mary Ann Squire, aged 22, was charged with larceny after a former conviction for felony. The felony was for theft of wood, for which she'd received 3 weeks' imprisonment. On the 25th of May 1850, at Great Torrington, she'd stolen a purse containing silver to the value of 9 shillings, the property of Jane Dowling of Ware Gifford. She received a sentence of 7 years' transportation, and the judge, in handing down his sentence, declared, "Let them be transported to such parts beyond the seas as Her Majesty shall direct for the term of 7 years." A Devon newspaper article on the 8th of August 1850 also gives this account. Jane Dowling deposed that she was in Great Torrington on the 25th of May. She was sitting in a cart outside the shop of Mr. Legg, a glover. The purse was in her lap. She rose up to go into the shop and dropped her purse. She did not miss it until she was about to leave the shop. On coming out, she saw the prisoner, Mary Tucker, and another person named Mary Squire standing in the passage. She asked them if they'd seen her purse, which they denied. They then went away, and the prosecutrix followed them and again asked them about the purse. Mary Tucker wanted to be searched. The purse was found at her feet. Jane Dowling identified the purse as hers and said to Mary Tucker, "You've had the purse and you must have the money." Mr. Cox, defending, said Mary Squire had been tried and transported last sessions for stealing the purse. The purse was dropped in the street. Mary Tucker was standing on your left hand and the purse was picked up on the prisoner's right. Newspaper extracts give evidence of Charlotte Squire, Mary's sister, being a witness at Mary Tucker's trial. She lived in the same house. And that on the 25th of May, Mary Tucker went out and did not return until the afternoon. When she came back, she told Charlotte to put on her bonnet and shawl and go and look for her sister. Charlotte informed Mary Tucker that her sister, Mary Squire, was home just now. Charlotte was prompted to ask what was the matter, to which Mary Tucker answered that somebody had lost their purse and she'd been accused of taking it. She added that Mary Squire had got the money and she had the purse but had dropped it. She said she was expecting Mr. Fussell, the constable, to arrive, and vaguely added that she might have thrown the purse over Mr. Lake's high wall. During her trial, Mary Tucker, in a show of loyalty, announced that she'd sell off all of her things to get Mary Squire freed. From the Exeter newspaper regarding Mary Tucker's trial, it says that John Fussell, the constable of Great Torrington, apprehended Mary Tucker. When they got to the lock-up, Mary Tucker said to Mary Squire, "Why don't you give up the money if you've got it?" Mary Squire answered that Mary Tucker knew that she knew nothing about it. Mary Squire then offered to pay the constable for his trouble and give up the money if she were let free. Fussell refused to do so, and they went to Tucker's house, where Mary Squire produced 8 shillings and a sixpence. Mr. Cox remarked that the actual thieves in the present case had actually been tried and transported, and that the present prisoner was being brought up, really, for being a participator in the theft. The learned counsel directed the jury's attention to the fact that the finding of an article was not a felony until such article had been appropriated by the finder. There was no evidence, the learned advocate continued, to bring the theft home to the prisoner, who had not the slightest benefit from it. Squire had the money, and Squire had given up the money to the constable. The learned judge, in summing up, directed the attention of the jury to the fact that the indictment charged the prisoner with stealing the purse, independent of the money, and pointed out the evidence on the subject. The jury acquitted the prisoner. Mary Ann Squire was overcome with guilt, fear, and despair. The prisoner Squire, in the hope of being liberated, acknowledged having picked it up, that is the purse, and accompanied the officer to the garden of the house of the other prisoner, Tucker, where she produced the money. The magistrates not considering the evidence sufficiently clear against Tucker, she was discharged with a caution, but Squire was committed for trial at the next quarter sessions. She was placed back in the cell and shortly afterwards visited by Cole, a constable, and found to have attempted suicide by hanging herself with her bonnet ribbon. He immediately cut her down and called Mr. Cowdery, a surgeon, who found she'd sustained considerable injury, under whose care she still continues, with every prospect of her recovery. The prisoners, especially Tucker, are notoriously bad characters, and both of them had been previously convicted of felony. After she recovered and after her trial, Mary Ann Squire was sent to Millbank Prison. On the 30th of March 1851, she awaited transportation at Westminster, London. Her age was given as 23 and her birthplace as Torrington, Devon. The Millbank Prison Register describes her as 22 and a glover. Her Tasmanian convict papers describe her as a country servant, 5 foot 3 inches tall and 20, with fair complexion, brown hair and hazel eyes. Mary Ann remained at Millbank Prison until she was sent to the barque Anna Maria on the 30th of September 1851. She left Woolwich, England on the 7th of October 1851, bound for Van Diemen's Land. On the voyage she was affected by dysentery and she was in the sick bay on at least 3 occasions, being disposed to duty. The Anna Maria arrived in Van Diemen's Land on the 26th of January 1852. On the 3rd of February, Mary Ann was working for M. Warham of Brisbane Street, Hobart Town. By the 6th of February, she was at the Newtown factory hiring depot and began working for Richard Chilton. On the 9th of August, she was given a sentence of 4 days in the cells for disobeying the orders of Richard Chilton. By the 15th of August, she was working for E. Hodgson. Over the next 20 years, Jonathon and Mary Ann had 9 children. Edward in 1854, Walter in 1855, Francis in 1857, Albert in 1858, Francis Alice in 1860, Frederick in 1862, John Philip in 1864, Charlotte Rebecca in 1866, and Lucy Rosetta in 1872. The first 2 of these children were born in Tasmania, and the remainder were born in Victoria. This means that Jonathon had 17 children by 3 wives. 6 children to Elizabeth, 2 to Anne, and then 9 to Mary Ann. Mary Ann received a ticket of leave on the 4th of October 1853 and a conditional pardon on the 19th of December 1854. It is likely that Jonathon Sr. and Jonathon Jr. travelled to the Victorian goldfields and discovered gold which funded the purchase of their rural Victorian properties. In the 1853 Bendigo Goldfields petition, it contains the name Jonathon Harris, and Jonathon Harris Jr.'s death notice has a mention of him being the first finder of gold in Hustler's Reef, Sandhurst. The family moved to Victoria, it seems, by early 1857. They settled fairly quickly in Benalla, as the last of the 7 children were all born there. Together with Jonathon, Mary Ann gained acceptance and respectability. They worked hard and made a new life with their family in Victoria. Mary Ann features with her daughter, as well as other relatives and neighbours, on the 1891 women's suffrage petition. The family survived many storms, floods and winds over the years in their little hut at Benalla. In 1870, it said that a tremendous hurricane swept over the Benalla district, threatening destruction to every building and causing consternation to all the inhabitants. At daylight, it was discovered that a great flood was inevitable. The flood continued to rise and by 1 o'clock swept through most of the houses in Bridge Street. Again, in October of that year, by 11 o'clock we were surrounded by a depth rendering it necessary for a horse to swim. Harris had to vacate. On the 1st of May 1872, Jonathon Sr. was one of the official witnesses to the marriage at the Holy Trinity Church in Benalla of his granddaughter, Alice Rebecca Clark, to William Moore. Alice was the daughter of Jonathon's second oldest child, Elizabeth Harris. On the 6th of March 1885, Mary Ann Harris was the purchaser of a block of land in Egmont Street, Benalla. Her name is on the Benalla rate roll for this and other properties in the area, and after Jonathon's death, it included the house and land in Garden Street. The rate roll describes her occupation as a nurse. Her will shows that she left the Garden Street Benalla home and land to her son and his family. The estate, though it was humble, consisted of house, land, furniture and cattle. Jonathon remained in Benalla for the rest of his life, and he died at the age of 91 on the 4th of October 1891 in his Garden Street home. His death certificate indicates that he died of senile decay. It says that his parents were John Harris and Hilda Harris, née Nunman. His death certificate lists 14 of his children, not the 2 children born to Anne Grubb, possibly because Jonathon may not have talked about his marriage to Anne, as it was never properly annulled, and also a child that was born with Mary Squires that died as an infant. Another reason why Anne Grubb and the 2 sons were not listed is Frederick, Mary Ann and Jonathon's son, was the informant on the death certificate. Mary Ann Harris died on the 3rd of July 1894 at Benalla. And just an interesting piece of information, Dr. Nicholson, who was the family doctor for the Harris family, was actually the doctor who attended Ned Kelly after his wounding. It was Dr. Nicholson who removed the green sash from Ned Kelly after the siege. And the green sash was given to Ned Kelly as a child from the family of a child that he saved from a flooded creek when they lived at Beveridge. This sash is actually still in existence and on display in a Victorian museum. Mary Ann Harris's obituary reads, Mrs. Harris, one of the oldest and most esteemed residents of Benalla West, has died during the past week. In part 2, I'll be covering all of Jonathon's 13 children and what became of them.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.